The next learning target we're going to talk about is something called the aperture. The aperture is an opening within the lens that can change in size based on how much light you want to let through. The other thing it does is it changes something called the depth of field. It's either going to be something called a short depth of field or a long depth of field. Short depth of field means that you're going to have a blurred background, where a long depth of field means you're going to have the background more in focus. Our review from the previous learning target about shutter speed is this line here. Remember the information that goes on the line. The slower shutter speed means that we're going to have a little bit more light coming into the frame and more motion being seen. Whereas on the other side, we're going to have less light into the picture and more frozen action. So there's our review here, and there's our number line on the top here for shutter speed settings, and two picture examples, one with light painting and the other with waves moving through the frame but frozen in action. Okay, here's what an aperture actually looks like inside a camera. Now, some devices that you use may not actually have an aperture they can change. For example, cell phone cameras are generally just one aperture and that's it. There's not enough space inside these devices to be able to change or have a mechanical changing aperture. So those will tend to be much lower aperture numbers, which are bigger openings. If you have multiple lenses on your device, each one probably has a different aperture to change how the picture looks. So in a traditional lens, these are again small blades of metal just like the shutter that can condense down to make a smaller opening or open up to be a larger opening to let more light through. Here's how an aperture affects exposure. Remember, exposure is how bright or dark a picture is. Here again is a line that represents the dial, and the direction that you go on the dial is going to change how much light you're getting in the picture. If you go towards the left, you're going to have a larger opening, and that's going to let in more light. If you go to the right, you're going to have a smaller opening, and it's going to have less light. Notice the connection between the number that you see below the picture examples for openings and the size opening that you see in the picture. Right? The lower number has a bigger opening, whereas the higher number has a smaller opening. And we'll get into the reason why this is the case. Usually if you're taking pictures in low light, you're going to have a lower number, which is a bigger opening. If you're taking pictures with lots of light, for example on a bright sunny day or a snowy situation where you're got a lot of light bouncing back up into your picture, you're probably going to be at a higher f number. So here's the way that it's expressed, aperture. It's something called the Fstop number, and that's what that F represents in front of the number. Sometimes you'll see a little side dash here, slash, after the F number, before you see the number. But Fstop is another word that we use to say, to describe aperture. All right, and here again is that same picture example showing the F with the number and how it represents the opening inside the lens. This is maybe the most confusing thing, well, certainly in this unit, but possibly this class. When we're talking about the amount of light, a larger number means that you're going to get less light. So a smaller or a larger F number means less light. And this comes into play when we're talking about stops of light and calculating our exposure for learning target 5. You really need to understand how the numbers relate to light and how much light you get. So that red text on there, that's talking about for larger f-stop numbers you get less light. The green text on there, the smaller f number, means that you're going to have a larger opening, which gives you more light. But like opening the door more, you're going to get more light through that door, whereas if you have the door open just a little bit, you get less light. Here's how the aperture number is calculated. So this is a formula that you'll want to remember for our test. So when we have a length of a lens determined, so for example if it was a 100 millimeter lens, that might be the top number that we put on there. And we compare that to the diameter of the aperture opening. So let's just say that it was a 50 millimeter aperture opening. Well, we divide the length of the lens by the diameter of the aperture opening, and my example that I just gave you would be f2, because it would be 2 times that the diameter would fit across the length of the lens. Here's just a picture example of an f2.8. So let's say that this lens was opened up as wide as it can go. So this is a 2.8 lens, an f2.8 lens. We'd imagine that diameter for the opening, and we'd lay that circle on its side next to the lens, and we'd see how many times it fits across. Well, this fits about 2.8 times, so that's why it's f2.8. So our bigger opening makes a lower f number. Here's an example on the flip side. So same lens length, but we have a smaller opening now. And you can see that that small opening fits 9 times down the length of the lens, so that's why it's f9. Another term for aperture is AV, and it's also a mode on your camera. Just like for shutter, it has TV as its mode, where you choose the shutter and the camera helps you with the rest. AV, you choose the aperture and the camera will help you with the rest. So let's say that you really care about how your depth of field looks in a picture. Well, choose AV mode and you can affect the depth of field, and then the camera will help you with the rest. Any of these modes that we're learning in this class, P, TV, AV, M, are great places to be at. As you get more advanced in photography, and if you have time to set up a shot, manual is going to be your best option. But it's okay to kind of start with these more automated modes as you get a little bit more into photography. Here's something called depth of field. That's what our aperture is going to be changing for how the picture looks. So depth of field, another term to describe that is DOF acronym. So you could have a long depth of field, which is LDOF, and a short depth of field, which is SDOF. But this talks about something called the plane of focus. So your plane of focus is how much is actually in focus within an image. So you're going to have some parts of the picture up close to the camera that are going to be out of focus, and some areas that are out of our plane of focus a ways away from the camera that are also not in focus. This just has to do with the limitations of a lens and the aperture with how much it can really have in focus based on how far away something is that we're focusing on, but also the aperture that we use and even the type of lens that we're using. You could have a focal length that's more zoomed in, so a telephoto lens. That's going to create a shorter depth of field than a wide angle lens, which is a shorter focal length. So here's what it looks like in 2 picture examples. So depth of field can be short or it can be long. Here's a short depth of field example, and here's a long depth of field example. You'll see that they focused on this screw right here, and the screws in front of and behind that are blurred out. Whereas this image, they focused on the person, and we've got the bridge in focus here, and the trees way in the background in focus as well. So depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest objects that can be judged as being in focus within the camera as we're taking the picture. And this is all depending on, again, 3 things. You've got your focal length, which we'll get into in Unit 2, our aperture, which is what this learning target is, and also the distance that you are away from what you're focusing on. So here's 2 more pieces of information that we add on to our little dial line here. So if we can just remember these core pieces of information that go on the line, we're going to be in a good situation here for understanding how aperture affects a picture. So we add short depth of field on the left-hand side and a long depth of field on the right-hand side. So that represents our f number that we're choosing, our aperture number that we're choosing. Here's a shortcut. So you want to write this down in your notes. A big f number means that you're going to have more in focus. A low f number means you have less in focus. So as we're talking about our depth of field, this is a good thing to just write down and remember. Here's a top-down view, so a bird's eye view of a situation on the image result. This is with the short depth of field. Again, that plane of focus is really narrow. That cream color here, that's what's in focus. The red is what's out of focus. Here's a different picture example. We've got our person that's again in focus, but our depth of field is longer. Here's a picture taken at f2.8. Notice how blurred the background is behind. This was taken, really up close, so that helps to magnify how blurred things are in the image. Here's another picture taken with a high aperture number, so f22, and you'll notice that even close up to the camera, so this was on the cliff where the camera was, that's in focus, but also far, far away, it's all in focus too. So give yourself a little guess here based on what we've been learning. Is this a long or a short depth of field? Well, since the foreground and background are in focus, we know this is a long depth of field. In this image, we have a long depth of field. In this image, we have a short depth of field. Here's some examples. We've got f2.8 here. This was a 70 to 200 lens at 70 millimeters, so it wasn't too zoomed in, but a little bit more telephoto. Set up the camera on a tripod so it wouldn't move, had the same focus in each of the images, and as you see between each of these pictures, the background gets more and more in focus, the higher the f number that you get to. That concludes this learning target.